Well, imagine if you're sitting in Vilnius or in St. Petersburg, and while you're sitting there, you discover that Russian forces have now moved to the Dnieper River, have crossed bridges, and are headed down into Odessa. And at the same time, Russian forces are now breaking out of Bakhmut and headed towards Kharkov, ready to turn west towards the river again, where Kiev sits. Remember, the Russians also destroyed one of the most important bridges over the river that borders Ukraine and Moldova.
Right.
Nobody paid any attention to that. There are actually two bridges. One's a rail bridge, and then there's a traffic bridge. Traffic bridge is extremely important because it can sustain and hold and carry all the heavy military traffic. With that out of business, you're not going to get into Ukraine from the southwest of Ukraine anymore. And listen, we've got a lot of troops in Romania. There was lots of talk about moving through Moldova and down into Ukraine. I think that's gone. That option is gone. If we try to do it, it would be disastrous. So that leaves Poland as a single theater where you've got lots of American troops and lots of Polish troops. But if you're sitting in either of these places and the Russians are advancing, who wins that particular outcome? I mean, obviously, if you're in Vilnius and the Russians are advancing, it's a very uncomfortable feeling. If you're in St. Petersburg and you're talking about going to gold-backed currency in a new world led largely by China, Russia, and India, well, that's an extremely good feeling. I think that's where we're headed.
Moving stateside, because I've noticed that there's an interesting phenomenon which is characteristic of the upcoming presidential race, where you have, with all their imperfections and perfections, but you have two candidates basically, and you worked for one and the other one interviewed you recently. We're talking about Donald Trump and Robert Kennedy Jr., and they're framing the situation in basically the terms that we discuss here on Votum TV and a lot of other dissidents discuss with you and other channels and podcasts. But when Trump was asked recently at that CNN town hall, whose side are you rooting for? And I think he made a very profound statement. I'm saying this sincerely. He says, the important thing right now is to stop the killing. Which people would say, oh, but Trump is bullish, he's a blowhard. And all of a sudden he becomes this humanitarian, which I think was sincere, because the important thing you have to do right now, considering the slaughterhouse that Ukraine is you got to stop the killing. And then you have Robert Kennedy Jr., who's going even deeper into the issues and talking about NATO expansion and all the other aspects that contributed to this war. And I'm thinking, if that isn't a sign in some way, obviously, that some good can still happen in the political realm in the United States, especially that, Donald Trump has been exonerated right now. Bobby is doing pretty well in the polls, considering he's a first timer and he's fairly fresh. And the panic on a lot of other people's sides. I mean, Biden has said he's not going to have any debates because why? He's the incumbent. Are you seeing any political signs of hope in the United States on the level of electoral politics, having to consider they have two candidates who are basically speaking our speak, so to say, or the truth on Ukraine and Russia?
Well, I think both men, both Robert Kennedy Jr. and Donald Trump, understand that for Americans, for us, this is not a question of size. But you're talking about men who have not decided that Russia is the mortal enemy of all things good on the planet. In other words, they see Russia as a major power, someone with whom we want to do business, someone with whom we want to get along, someone who has legitimate security interests. We also see Ukraine as a state with legitimate security interests. And so they've come to the conclusion, this is not about winning and losing anymore. It's about stop the bleeding and halt the killing if you can do it. That's a good sign, and I think it's very sincere. There is no one in Washington that I am aware of who is interested in that. They are all opposed to it. Now, when I say all, I'm sure you can find some Republicans and a handful of Democrats that agree with both RFK and Donald Trump, but the vast majority of people here don't. And remember, no one wants to stand up and say, gee, we miscalculated. We didn't understand what we were doing. Remember, we finally said that in the 70s after Vietnam had ended. McNamara said, well, we didn't understand the culture. Well, you idiot. There were a lot of people that understood exactly what was going on. You wouldn't listen to them. That's the same problem now. Now, beyond that, you've got a different kind of problem. I don't know if anybody there has followed Governor DeSantis, who was being lauded as a potential
Yes.
Republican candidate. He was, of course, endorsed by George Soros. And unsurprisingly, after saying initially we have no vital strategic interest in Ukraine that would justify the use of American military power there or any involvement, 2.5 days later, he came back. Oh, I was wrong. My donors called me and told me I was wrong. Right now, we have government by donors, rich, powerful figures on the left, huge quantities of money who are pouring it in to whomever they need to get the outcome they want. So the whole Republican facade that we are somehow or another essentially democratic has fallen. I think people are beginning to see, how do you elect yourself out of this mess? I don't know. I mean, this is something we're going to find out over the next 12 to 24 months. Can we actually hold fair and free elections that are not corrupted? I mean, how do you get around this absentee ballot insanity? You know, how do you stop the influence of someone like Zuckerberg, who moves into blue state cities, big cities around the country, spends $450 million to effectively support actions that we largely would regard as, if not illegal, then certainly wrong. And in some cases, you know, the stuffing of ballot boxes with large numbers of absentee ballots. I remember the last election, I was getting calls from people in Las Vegas saying that in the lobbies of hotels and casinos, there were ballots everywhere. All you had to do was fill it out and stuff it into the box. No one bothered to look carefully at any of it. So the question is, can we even hold an election that's going to be valid in the thinking and the eyes of the American people? That I don't know. And we are distracted ultimately by a lot of other things. The top priority, I would say, for most people right now, other than trying to deal with the economic issues that are not going to go away quickly, given the fact that it took years for us to get to this point, is obviously the border. No security for the country on its borders. People are being brought in. I mean, you and others have pointed out how well Ukrainian refugees have been treated. Well, I would tell you that these people coming into the country are receiving benefits and support that Americans can't get. It's very strange. So these things are a big issue. And then, of course, there's criminality in the big cities. No one's willing to enforce the law anymore. If you enforce the law, you have a high probability of being attacked for doing so. So these are the number one priorities here, not what's happening overseas. The bad news, again, is that Americans are not looking carefully at what's going on overseas. They don't understand the potentialities for real disaster. I hope that the Europeans will wake up. I keep hoping that we'll see some governments change. I know the Germans have really, really had it with Scholz. There's no doubt about that. But I see no action. You've got to get a new government. You've got to get new leadership, steps up and says, that's it. And how do you recover economically without cheap energy? Cheap energy is the lifeblood of civilization. We can do it, but it's going to take us time. It'll take us about 5 years to recover from the damage that's been done over the last 2.